So we're going to start off by setting up our environment. And the first thing we're going to do to set up our environment is to get our relational database. In this course, we're going to be using MySQL as our relational database. And that's because it's a fairly robust database and it is also free. At least there's a free version of it. And you can, of course, use whatever database that you want. And you're just going to have to make a few different changes in the configuration. But if you want to follow along here, you can go ahead and get MySQL. And you'll want to go to mysql.com. From here, you'll click products. And it can be a little bit confusing to navigate around here because of the different MySQL editions. But what we want is the free community edition. So if we go to this download MySQL community server link, then here we can find the general availability releases. And you can choose whatever operating system you're using. In this case, I'm using Microsoft Windows. And there is actually a MySQL installer MSI file that makes it really easy to install. So I'm just going to go ahead and download this. And you can see that it gives me two choices, either a web-based installer or the full installer. I'm just going to go ahead and choose the web-based one. And you don't actually have to sign up here. It looks like you do, but this is just a little trick to try and get you to sign up. But you can just click this no thanks, I'll just start my download link. And when you do that, it will go ahead and start this MSI, which we can run. Then you should see this welcome screen where we can click Install MySQL Products. We need to accept the license, click Next, and I'm going to go ahead and let this do a check to find the latest products, which we already have the latest, so there shouldn't be any problem. Then we'll click Next, and I'm just going to choose the developer default. If you want to, if you understand a little bit more about MySQL, you can choose one of these other ones, either do a full or a custom, but developer default will work for most people. So we're going to click Next, and then you'll see what the requirements are. And these are the requirements based on that default developer profile. So you'll see some things like the Visual Studio and Microsoft.NET. If you don't have these things, so if you're missing some of these requirements and you do want to still install this, you can go back here and go to custom. And then from here, you can go ahead and pull out the different things that you don't want. But you might as well just do the developer default unless you have a problem, because you're going to get everything you need. So I'm going to go ahead and click execute. And one more time on the execute, you can see it's installing the Python connectors that it needs. So all the prerequisites are met. Now I'm going to click next. And now it's going to basically download each one of these components and install them. And just to briefly go over some of these, we have the MySQL server. This is our main database engine. We have this workbench, which is a very nice tool for interacting with MySQL. It makes it easy for you to run queries and to see the database without having to do everything from the command line. We've got a notifier, which isn't that important, some Excel connectivity, this connector J, which basically has our JDBC driver, and then a .NET driver as well, our documentation, and then some samples. So let's go ahead and click execute. And you can see it's going to download all this and install it. And I'll go ahead and let this happen, and then we'll resume from here. So you can see everything is installed now. I'm just going to go ahead and click next. And then we need to configure MySQL, the actual server part. So we're going to click next. The config type, we can choose what our config type is. In most cases, we're just going to want this development machine. The default port is 3306. And by default, it will open the firewall so that you can access this from the network. I'm just going to leave this as the default. I'm not going to select the show advanced options. Now we need to set a root password because all MySQL databases need to have a root user, which is basically the admin user or the user that can access everything in the database. So I'm just going to set for the root password. Obviously, you don't want to do this if you're storing any sensitive data in your database, but I'm just going to keep things pretty simple. You can also add a user account here. Let's go ahead and add one called app user, and we can put this on all hosts or local host. Doesn't really matter. The role, we're going to leave this as DB admin so that they'll have basically full rights to the database. Authentication will be MySQL, and I'm going to make this password app user. Again, you probably want to use a more secure password, for your database. Now we're going to click next, and then we can basically set this to run as a Windows service and start it at system startup. If you do install this, remember that you have this running when you're done with MySQL. You might not want to always have this running as a service. If you don't choose to install this as a Windows service, you can always start the service yourself, or if you don't choose to start the MySQL server at system startup, you can go into services and start that. It's up to you. I'm going to go ahead and leave this as default and also leave this as the default to standard system account for running it. Then we'll click next. It's going to configure the product. We'll click next again and next one more time. And then we can start the MySQL workbench right afterwards. And you can see that this brings up this MySQL workbench, which has a lot of different tools in here for administering your server, for doing some data modeling, and for doing SQL development. This is probably the most common thing that you'll use, which if we just double click this, we are asked for our root password. And if we enter that, then it takes us into a window here where we can see a couple of databases that are already populated with some data, and we can go ahead and run queries against these. For example, I could do a select star from city and run this, and I'm getting all of the data from that particular database. So this is a pretty useful tool if you want to use MySQL. We're not going to get too much into this, as we're going to be mostly interested in just using MySQL for Hibernate, but now you should have MySQL installed, and we are ready to get started with a Java project and actually get Hibernate.